So we are at an inflection point right now, in my opinion, in state and national history in regards to political discourse and a sense of how do we actually engage in this environment, be it your company or the universities or in general your institutions. I think people don't know what the rules of engagement really are. And so I decided to bring a couple of panelists here of both state and national prominence. We've got Mike Madrid, who is a national leader on politics and policy, and you may recognize him. He's a regular commentator on MSNBC and a number of other national networks. And he's also a leader in both polling and focus group work, and I think has one of the best understandings of the political electorate of anybody in the United States right now. Mike is also, I'm going to say this really quietly for the Democrats in the room, Mike's a Republican, because we wanted to make sure that we're equal opportunity here. And to prove that, to his right, which doesn't make any sense because you should be sitting to his left, is Ian Calderon. Ian Calderon is the former majority leader of the California State Assembly. So there wasn't, in essence, a bill that made it to the floor without Ian not only having a major role in it for a significant amount of time. He's one of the longest serving and youngest, actually, majority leaders in the state. He currently works in a broader sort of public affairs and strategic affairs space, helping out local governments and businesses across the state. But Ian's understanding of state policy and state politics is unparalleled, and we have in this room people that need space and understanding of both. I'm going to be working with the great Chancellor Reeve to help moderate this panel, so much so that we're going to share a microphone, and I'm going to hand it over to Chancellor Reeve, who's going to start with the first questions for Mike and Ian. Chancellor?
Oh, thanks, Zach. So my first question follows up on your comments, and it's for you, Mike. I worry a lot in my own household about the polarization that we see. I certainly see it at the university. We worry about it very much. And so how do we manage, all of us who are employers, the political polarization, and how do you think we can communicate internally about that within our groups about the 2024 election?
Well, that's a great question. How's that, better? Okay. Might want to hear the answer, I guess, right? Look, one of the biggest challenges I think facing our civil discourse as a country right now is our this relatively new phenomenon, at least since the post-Cold War era, where we're really dead set on tearing down institutions, social institutions that may not agree with us. In some dysfunctional way, we've actually partisanized institutions. So we look at like the academy or a government or the media, and we say those are on the left. And on the right, it may be more corporations and business, the church, community, military. Everybody's got their associated institutions. And so what we're really hell-bent on, for some unfortunate reason, is the actual destruction of those institutions as messengers when we disagree with them. And one of the reasons why that has risen as a common characteristic in this democracy right now and put it in such a precarious position is an idea called negative partisanship. Now, we've all heard of partisanship, we've all heard of hyper-partisanship, but the idea of negative partisanship is the concept that I am against things in much more passionately and vehemently than I am for things. And so my opposition to you actually defines who I am. That's how I define my identity. And we're seeing this actual change in party registration, where over the past 20 years there's been this strong tendency to disaffiliate with both major parties. That is now in the past 5 or 6 years reverberated back to people jumping out of their independent or decline to state silos and becoming partisan Democrats or partisan Republicans again, not because they're for the parties, but because they have found a party that they are extremely against and feel that they need to align with an organization that is against those folks. So when you are seeing this with students on your campuses, employees in your workforces, residents in your communities, you have to understand that the natural reaction of an increasing number of people in those constituencies is to identify what they are against. And so it's always important to get people in the beginnings of those conversations, whether it's one-on-one or whether it's, again, your workforce, your residents, your students, to have them articulate what that is that they're for. And this can take time. is very difficult because we've been habituated over a series of election cycles, a number of years, to partisanize virtually everything, partisanize our institutions, and start to begin conversations, and they're not really conversations much anymore. They're more disagreements based off of what we are against. We've lost that basic ability and desire, frankly, to identify what it is that we individually are for, and if you can't do that, you can't find commonality. You cannot find common ground.
So, yeah, thank you. That really gives us a lot to think about as educators, too. One of the things I worry about is lots of people talking, hardly anybody listening. That's a part of that equation, too, I think. But, we heard earlier from Speaker Rivas, from Assembly Member Addis about that we have, this majority of Democrats in the state legislature. So, Ian, we sort of have single-party rule here in California. Do you think that might change in 2024?
Yeah, no, that's not going to change. I mean, it could get worse or better. It was interesting. When I was the majority leader, we used to always have this joke, Anthony Rendon was the speaker, I was the majority leader, and we always had this, this 2/3 threshold. Once you have 54 members, you had 2/3 of the legislature, which means you could pass anything. Once you have 2/3 vote, the highest voting threshold is 2/3 to raise taxes. You're really in this position where, your side, your interests are coming to you and they're saying, well, what's your excuse for not being able to pass this? You have the votes to be able to pass this. And we'd always say, well, we'd rather have 53 members to kind of solve for that problem. But I don't see that changing, and it's a difficult dynamic because when you get more members of the same party, more issues arise that then you start to focus on each other and you start focusing on yourselves. And so you have progressives and you have moderates, and you have progressives saying we're Democrats and now we're going to, rather than targeting Republicans because they're so relatively irrelevant and we don't necessarily need their votes or they can't impact anything in the legislature, we're going to now focus our attention on moderates, and we're going to we're going to potentially find other candidates to run against maybe some of our moderate colleagues, and so it becomes a little bit more treacherous politically and from a policy standpoint, just because now you have all these different considerations. And I served with Speaker Rivas. We played softball together. That's how we got to know each other. There was the Sacramento City Softball League, and we'd play a lot of softball together and try to spend time with as many of our colleagues as we possibly could. And I think he's well equipped to be able to handle the dynamics, but make no mistake how difficult his job really is. First, he's a full-time babysitter. There is no shortage of issues that are going to be at his doorstep at any given time. It's going to be constant, and I know this because I lived it. I was the majority leader, and I positioned myself so that, I was there to protect the politics of the House, but also protect the leadership and maintain the different personalities. It is literally in the title of majority leader to promote harmony amongst the membership. Well, quite a fucking job that is. And, and so, what he needs very, very reliable people in his caucus to be with him, to support him, and to help insulate him from all the different things that are going to come his way. And he's going to have to manage all the different interests, whether they're progressive interests or moderate interests, so that the priorities of the legislature can be successful, but also to keep things from blowing up internally, because you may not see that playing out in the public, but it certainly happens in caucus. There are a lot of fights that we would get in internally, and it's worse now, in my opinion, than when I was in the legislature, just given the times and the different political realities that we exist in today, and everybody, having this need to say, I am this is me, and I stand here, and I can't compromise because then that's compromising on my beliefs. A lot of those cause tension, they cause issues, and he certainly has a difficult job, but no doubt is well equipped to handle it. But I think what you guys have to recognize is that there's a lot of power that is now coming from this area. And you have a huge opportunity where if you had a moment, your moment is now to flex your muscle and to ask for things that you might not have been able to ask for in the past, or perceived that you didn't have the position or standing to ask for. You have the speaker, you have an incoming pro tem who's from rural Northern California. You have a stronger, more robust Central Coast caucus, legislative caucus, and I think that you guys, can really use this current time to your advantage by making sure that you're communicating with your legislators and your delegation, communicating with the speaker, and really figuring out what are the things that you're going to be leaning into over the next year or two, and where can you have the greatest amount of impact.
And ask for big things, generational things. This is that moment. Ian's exactly right. You're not going to find that confluence of power in this area perhaps ever again, certainly not for a generation. So be thinking for your own institutions, for your own enterprises, what changes generationally could be made here with the people in power, and be bold and ask for them, because the opportunity will probably not come again.
And that moment could be relatively short-lived. I mean, Mike McGuire, who's going to be the pro tem in the Senate, he's gone in 2 years. He's running for insurance commissioner while trying to be the pro tem. That's going to pose all its own challenges within his own caucus. Speaker Rivas, he is, he's strong, but he's also, he's going to be making a whole lot of committee changes, and that's going to cause different, That's going to cause different challenges and opportunities for you guys if you understand what it is that you want and have a plan to take advantage of. But who knows what his other political aspirations are. So I wouldn't become complacent and think, okay, there's enough time, we can do it. Your time is right now, and your clock is already ticking.
Ian, to that point then briefly, you're a CEO of a local company, you are the president of a community college, you're the chancellor. Give me the nuts and bolts of how somebody actually activates that power from the Central Coast right now. How do they, do they meet with a staffer? Are they actually asking for a direct meeting with Rob? What are they doing? Give them the technical skills to leave here today so that they can actually effectuate the generational change Mike's talking about.
Yeah, one of the more astounding things that I learned when I first got elected, I was the first millennial ever elected to the state legislature. I just turned 27. And everybody just assumed that when I got elected, by osmosis, I now know every single thing about every issue. And that couldn't be further from the truth. I loved the job because of the access to information, and I had the ability to learn about a lot of different things. Whereas, a lot of people would come to me, they knew everything about their one issue, but I had to know a decent amount about every single issue. And that's a lot. So I guess what I'm really trying to say is, don't assume we know. Because I can guarantee you we don't. For the most part, we don't. We don't know unless we have those conversations, unless you really help us understand. And I also, you guys, you're in a unique position where I was an urban LA County legislator, and you have a lot of rural. You're a rural community. And so how can you communicate to people like me? When I'm looking at, I don't have any agriculture in my district, or I didn't have any, and I didn't represent any rural communities. Figure out how to talk to me and tie what happens here and that impacting me, because so many of the issues that would, whether it was the Central Valley or, and by the way, making the distinction that you're not the Central Valley or Central Coast, very different communities with, how do you tie that back to me? And working with your delegation and working with those legislators and figuring out, okay, this is what we can talk about, and this is how simplify things and just say nuts and bolts. This is the issue, and this is why it should matter to you. And having the courage to make that ask and being organized, and it's knowing the difference. So maybe it might be good for a university or a nonprofit organization to come directly to the legislator. But it's probably a little bit better if you're coming as a community and saying, we're all advocating for this. We want this as a community, and this is important to us for these reasons. And all of our legislators and our speaker, we need you to back us. We need you to support us, because what's the good of having all of this power and to be in all of these positions if we don't see that back at home?
Mike, I'm going to switch subjects. Thanks for that, Ian. You and I have been on panels across the country, in particular talking about the 2024 election for some time. People are scared. They don't know how to navigate this process. You've got a lot of regional and national leaders in this room right now. What is your take on the 2024 election? What advice would you give them for navigating the space? And ultimately, what's your prediction of how it's going to play out so that we can replay this in a year and a half and say that you were wrong?
I didn't even realize there was an election coming up. Is that next year already? Let me, thanks, Zach. Let me say this. Reading data, trends, polling numbers is what I do for a living. So with all of the caveats of anything can happen, and that's why we have elections, I will say a couple of things about the dynamics of this race and the mood of the electorate as it is shaping up. The fundamentals for an incumbent re-election, in my estimation, are very strong. And I want to articulate why, because it might defy what you might be reading in the public, especially as it relates to polls. We are in an environment right now where the job approval rating of the executive is at historic lows. Confidence in the economy as it stands and the current direction is at historic lows. Our trust in belief in social institutions is at historic lows. And there doesn't seem to be much to what I'm saying as it relates to an incumbent's re-election. But here's why I think the race is shaping up the way that it currently is. As I mentioned earlier in the previous answer, we are in a time where we're not just in a partisan environment, we're not just in a hyper-partisan environment, we have crossed the Rubicon into a negatively partisan environment. And so traditional indicators of voting behavior no longer apply. Job approval ratings for Joe Biden were at historic lows heading into the midterms. Dissatisfaction with the economy were at historic highs heading into the midterms. The generic ballot favored the Republicans to a very considerable degree, which suggested that we were going to experience a very significant red wave. All three major indicators that most prognosticators look for were wildly wrong. Why is that? The answer is because there are only two small demographic slivers which are actually still in motion in a negatively partisanized environment. You want to know what they are? Okay, take your pencils out. The first is college-educated, white, suburban Republican women. That's how narrow we're looking at this election. They are moving to the left. It wasn't just the Dobbs decision, but that was a big part of it. Just cultural issues generally. And make no mistake, both parties rather, are completely identified with cultural issues over economic issues. It's the first time in 30 years of looking at this data when I can say that quantifiably. But the other group, and here's where it gets interesting, is US-born Hispanic males, non-college educated blue-collar workers. They are shifting to the right. And it's not a small shift. You don't hear a lot about it because most of the media are college-educated folks speaking to college-educated folks. But the shift of Hispanic voters from the high point with Democrats in 2012 at 75% to its current state of Joe Biden running against Donald Trump is sitting at 59%. The difference of 75 to 59%, that's a 16-point swing in just 8 years. That's extraordinary change that is happening that we're not paying a lot of attention to. So one group is shifting to the left, the bottom group is shifting to the right. These are not people that are looking terribly close at the generic ballot. At least at the top end of the economic equation, it's college-educated white suburban women, the economy is not affecting their day-to-day as much as cultural issues are of importance to them. So when I see data that is telling me that Joe Biden's job approval ratings are low and that people don't have confidence in the economy, that may very well be true. But 95% of the voters that are responding to those answers are already spoken for. They're not that small sliver of those two folks, one moving left and one moving right, that are actually determining the outcomes of races and have since 2016. So 2016, 2018, 2020, 22 have all been very predictable when using that metric. And my suggestion is we're sizing up to look at an electorate very similar to what's happening this fourth election cycle in a row.
Oh, that's very interesting, Mike. Ian, the title, I think, of this panel is something like Headwinds. And so I was worrying a little bit about headwinds for the educational sector, places like UC Santa Cruz and the CSUs in the state. And do you have any ideas about how the state headwinds might relate to budget and to higher ed?
I would need to get specific. I need to take a look at some more information. But I mean, just generally speaking, you have a governor that, this last year, he made a lot of vetoes. And a lot of his vetoes, there were two categories, but the largest category was how it impacts the state budget. And they're anticipating that our deficit is going to be growing over the next couple of years. It's not going to be shrinking. And, this year there were a lot of gimmicks that were in the budget that allowed for, not using our rainy day fund. There is considerable likelihood that whatever deficit is going to come after is going to now be pulling from those rainy day funds. And so, I think it's, education is usually one of those topics where a lot of people come out, they're very passionate about it, and it's hard to make cuts to, but it's usually one of the first to end up getting cut because that's where the majority of the money ends up going, at least from a budget perspective. And so until we see, and you had late filing tax returns, we have to see what those revenues are going to end up looking like, what the state budget's going to end up looking like as a result of that, and how many dollars, are going to be impactful. So I think that's once we have those numbers, that'll give us a better idea of the type of pool of money that we're working with. But I mean, I certainly, from an education perspective, would be very worried about what our funding is going to look like in this next budget, just given the history of education funding and what happens when there are deficits and we're trying to make up money somewhere else.
Mike and Ian, we have about 5 minutes left, and so I'm going to ask you kind of the same question and in a little bit of a different lens. Mike, 2024, are you optimistic or pessimistic for the country? And what advice would you have for those that are here today in the best way that they can engage in the 2024 electoral process?
Another great question with a quick, easy answer.
That's why we gave you a clock, because we didn't trust.
Right in front of me, yeah.
Right in front of you, yeah.
You're running out of time, Mike.
Let me say this. I'm optimistic. I'm very optimistic. I'm going to speak at a 30,000-foot level here. I'm very optimistic about the idea of America, about the American experiment, and about this republic specifically that has come under increasing attack and scrutiny and doubt, even amongst some of its strongest adherents. We are at a moment in time in American history where our ability to resolve our problems has come into question. And whether it's from this hyper-partisanship that I've been talking about, whether it's from the influence of foreign actors, whether it's from the influence of our own dark money operations, or whether it's from emerging tribalism and our inability to get together, or social media, there's a long, long list of reasons why democracy has been reported to be on its last legs. But what I would suggest to you is this. A lot of what ails us at this moment in time as a country, I believe, is largely a function of this 30-year Pax Americana that we are just emerging from. America, without conflict and without struggle, like almost all people throughout history, don't do particularly well. This moment, this deep struggle that we are engaged in, where we are literally fighting for the idea of a republic, for the ideas that are basic and core to who we are simply the only way we can reinvigorate those cultural characteristics back into our society. There is no end game where there's just rainbows and unicorns and suddenly America is just this wonderful place to bounce around in the clouds on. America is literally defined by her struggle. And when we are sitting on the precipice of a fight that is no less consequential than the great Civil War we had 150 years ago, there will be one victor that will last no longer than one generation. This is our struggle. This is our moment. I feel confident that we are worthy of the moment, and it's incumbent upon each one of us to make sure that that happens through the course of things. So I see struggle as something virtuous in a society, and it's coming at the back end of really a 30-year post-Cold War era where our own hegemony may have been our own worst enemy.
Ian, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the state's future?
I'm optimistic. That doesn't mean I'm not scared. You know, I have 4 young kids. I left the legislature because I wanted to see my kids grow up. Politics in my mind was always going to be there, but you know, my kids are 6, 4, 3, and 2. And you know, I ran because I wanted to be a voice for my generation that wasn't represented at the table, and so my perspective was, how can you pass policy, you know, without all the voices that are going to be impacted by those policy, at least having a seat at the table. You know, I worked on things that I thought were important, not just to me, but to my generation was. It's like, you know, I worked a lot on long-term care issues, and people are like, why do you work on those? You're not a senior. Why do you work on those issues? I said, because it should be a millennial issue. You know why? Because the Great Recession happened, and guess what? My family, they lost their entire retirement trying to keep their business alive. They lost their home trying to keep their business alive. All of it. Yeah, my mom, my stepdad, they put everything into a business, not understanding how significant that recession was going to be, and they lost everything. They have no retirement. I'm their retirement. My brothers, we're their retirement. And if we don't have tools in place to protect them and take care of them, you know, that falls on us. And shame on us if we leave them in the lurch. And after all they've done for us and endured, you know, we don't have. You know, we don't have policies in place that, you know, helps them live a dignified life. You know, I'm optimistic because we can't afford to be anything else. We have to be optimistic because what we have is for all of its faults, too amazing of a thing to just let go and to be complacent and assume someone else is going to fix it. And, you know, and the only way, you know, that success happens is, it's what Mike says, it's all of us doing together and understanding what our role is, what our part is. Everybody plays a part in this room, plays a part in what, not just the future of this state's gonna look like, but the future of what our country's gonna look like. When you guys go out and you advocate for your causes, you're setting a tone. And what you're also doing is you're solving a need, which then gives confidence in the electorate, in the institution of government. That is what we're losing, and that is what we need now more than anything. That no matter what, even if the stewards of those institutions are failing those institutions, that the institution itself is strong and it's going to protect us. But the only way that happens is with accountability. The only way you have accountability is if everybody in this room holds those people, those stewards, accountable to delivering for the communities that they represent and not getting sidetracked by the life of Sacramento and all these lobbyists kissing your ass and telling you're so perfect and great and I want to be your friend and are never going to know your name once you're gone. Not falling in love with that bullshit. But falling in love with what you can deliver for the people that sent you to Sacramento to represent them. And that only happens is if you are in their office reminding them of what their job is, what is expected of them, and if that they don't deliver, you're not going to be there. And so that is what everybody in this room should be going up and having these meetings, or what perspective they should have in their mind is that, you know, right now, not only is your time to shine because of the power that is coming from the Central Coast and the elected officials that are in prominent positions, but your role as advocates, your role as a community, and what that produces so that people feel they have faith restored in government, the institution of government, and it helps us move through this very difficult time.
Amen. Well, I'd like to thank MBEP for letting me have a conversation with invite my friends for a conversation. I thought you'd like that. We've got 3 rock stars up here. If you don't mind thanking these 3 people who come in. Thank you all for letting us be here. It's still on.